I always like the older streetcars versus the green ones versus the newer ones, the red ones. When I was a little girl, my parents would take us on rides when we were kids. And one of my favorite parts of the ride was going on St. Charles Avenue. As you were taking this ride on St. Charles, I don't know, it just seemed happier up here. And it seemed very peaceful. My favorite part about a lot of it were the houses, mansions, what I consider to be mansions. And I would always think about what it was like to live that life. The beautiful oak trees, sometimes jogging up and down the street, walking their dogs. I even noticed back then that there were not a lot of people that looked like me in these neighborhoods. And now I know why.
Our lives are at further risk.
There's a common narrative that what we see in present-day New Orleans is the result of our own past actions or inaction.
When you gotta go to the grocery store with your gun on your pocket, that's a war zone.
History and data connects our present-day problems to past policy.
15 an hour.
Policies designed to limit or really even eliminate opportunities in minority communities.
When will this stop?
Policies whose legacies have become so institutionalized that while the physical line has been erased, the mental and social line remains.
If you really want to address crime, you got to think about the nucleus of the problem.
So, could a line drawn generations ago result in the poverty, crime, lack of education, and many other issues some New Orleanians face today?
And we're doing the same old crazy, insane things over and over and over again.
Whatever happens on Josephine Street stays on Josephine.
It's kind of funky. Is any milk in the refrigerator? Because I just
This is yakami, chicken wing yakami.
Hey, y'all.
Hey.
The Sunday family dinner tradition hasn't been done in my home in ages, but for the Jones family, this is an every Sunday thing. After church, they meet at their Central City home with the prepared dish. Now, that home is owned by Freddie Jones Sr. He's the patriarch of the family, and he's owned it since 1961. That is when the family moved to New Orleans from Alabama. So they invited me to this Sunday dinner so we can talk a little bit more about their origin story, and they gave me some really interesting history about the home.
Got me a little cornbread, because that's what I was supposed to be tasting.
Okay.
Tell us if it's too salty.
We got field peas, cornbread, cake, salad, country style ribs, pasta, and rice.
What is country style ribs?
It's almost like a boneless rib.
So Poppy's getting ready to bless the food.
Y'all ready?
We're ready.
The Father, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Thank you, oh God, for waking me up. And Father, we have food on the table. We can bless this food. Amen.
Amen. To make me sick. Cotton.
Pick cotton and flour the mule.
So y'all pick cotton?
They were sharecroppers. We were sharecroppers.
Oh.
Yeah. But whatever they got, they had to share. Not share. It take their share and ours. We didn't get none of the cotton, and that's where the money was.
My wife said she towed the water, and I towed the water to the ones in the field. Mm-hmm. We had to go to the pump or the spring, get 2 buckets of water, and gallon time we get to the field. You had to take it to the white man or woman, whoever was in there, bunch white. They had to drink first.
The white man would drink first, and then they would pass the water around. Mm-hmm. Okay.
The rule is, he get 3/3, and you get 1. Now, that sounds like a deal, but when you have to pay him for your the fertilizer, the seed, and in some cases using they mule tools and mule, you didn't get nothing.
What does a porter make? How much money?
At that time we were making $1.33. And that was good money at that time. Yeah.
And you did that for how long?
What is that, 30-something, 37 years?
How long did it take for you to save up and to buy the house here?
8 or 9 years. We wasn't saving up. We wasn't saving up.
Okay.
I borrowed the money from the credit union. My wife didn't want it.
She didn't want it? Why not?
She didn't want to move up here.
Did she tell you why she didn't want to live here?
She didn't like the people. All that cussing and drinking. Well, it was rough, the neighborhood.
When we first moved up here, they had a bar on every corner pretty much. So I'm available in Jackson Avenue. That was the Robbie Boy.
Okay.
And that was the place where a lot of the seamen used to come for the prostitutes.
Okay.
They would meet in the bar, and the hotel was right next door.
The house that we came to was a large house with a hall in the middle and rooms on the side. We opened up the rooms for our side, and the rooms were still on the other side, but it was a bordello.
A bordello? A brothel? Oh my gosh.
When we first moved, people used to come knocking on the door looking for people. It was terrible up here. The things that they did in front of children, you wouldn't believe.
Before the crack era, like in the mid-60s, is heroin that had moved in the neighborhood. Sometimes we used to go around the corner to play by our friend's house, and we would see somebody who done overdosed on heroin.
Oh no.
And it was like, it was a piece of paper on the ground. You would just step over that person like they wasn't even there.
And y'all would see all this?
Yeah.
Were there some communities where you thought that there was no way that you could purchase a house because this is not where they accept black people's loan applications?
Right down the street.
Down the street?
Matter of fact, on the other side.
On the side, St. Charles.
Yeah, not even before then, remember? Right.
Oh yeah, right, Carondelet.
Right. So Carondelet, from that point forward,
Yeah.
that was kind of off limits to everyone.
Yeah.
So I wasn't the only one who felt like there were some spaces where I just didn't belong. I grew up in New Orleans, so I always knew that there were some social lines that were drawn, but I wasn't as familiar with the physical lines that were drawn by the federal government to keep people like the Jones family contained to certain neighborhoods and people who earn like the Jones family contained to certain neighborhoods. It's called redlining. But the thing is, everything has an origin story, so I was really curious about how we got here in the first place. I'd never crave a po' boy because I don't eat bread like that.
Shoot. I'm going to give me a hot sausage with cheese. Oh, this is cool. Look at this place.
Right.
That's
Oh,
my
it's
kind of
really
place,
great.
man. Shoot. My name is Dr. Eric Anthony Johnson in urban, real estate development profession. Because this is New Orleans, high school makes a difference. Alumnus of Walter L. Cohen Senior High School. You know how New Orleans is.
Right.
First question is, where you go to school? I moved a lot when I was a child growing up, but predominantly grew up in uptown New Orleans. That was really sort of the origins of my life experience uptown New Orleans. So you hear this concept origin story, and you tend to hear it in the context of normally like a superhero in an origin story. But there's also sort of, for the lack of a better word, sort of villainous origin story. The early settlers basically purchased the highland in New Orleans. Everything else was basically sort of filled in. Before the Civil War, African Americans and whites in the city, they were sort of mixing in a little socially and physically and economically. And right after the Civil War, we start to see a city that becomes moving towards a greater segregated city. Right after Reconstruction, when African Americans were making progress, here comes Jim Crow. Let's knock it out of the box. It takes away that sort of progress. Heading into the early part of the 20th century, there is this sort of movement that's starting to happen to say, wait a minute, we need to start to separate ourselves from African Americans. So the New Orleans story really starts from a place that had some early sort of connections to quickly starting to dissipate. New Orleans started to become more framed like the northern cities. We hear a lot about, oh, the South was horrible, but the North was equally horrible in terms of residential segregation.
In the early part of the 20th century, we had racial zoning, which meant that neighborhoods could just explicitly say that only black people or only white people could live in them, and that the neighborhoods couldn't integrate. That was held to be unconstitutional in 1917. And even then, New Orleans still tried to enact a racial zoning ordinance. And the Louisiana Supreme Court upheld it, and the U.S. Supreme Court again had to correct that racial zoning ordinance in like the late 20s. Right after the Supreme Court said that we couldn't create neighborhoods based on race, we developed another tool that accomplished the same result, and that is single-family zoning. It created single-family zones for whites only, and the only use that was allowed in the neighborhood was a single-family home. So any other uses, apartments, industrial uses, commercial uses, things that were hazardous, all the other uses that were restricted and kept out of single-family zones were allowed in black neighborhoods, and that sort of created the scaffolding for redlining.
Great Depression. The idea was, let's jumpstart the construction industry through home ownership. Here comes the HOLC, Homeowners Loan Corporation, that now creates these maps that starts to divide cities. New Orleans is no different.
Banks came in and they saw white neighborhoods were created to be the most desirable neighborhoods, the green designation on the redlining map, and black neighborhoods that were set up as overcrowded and hazardous places were of course given the red designation on the map. It helped institutionalize a system where if you were black, you were not able to get a loan yourself. But neighborhoods where blacks lived were also not deemed acceptable for investment. Whites learned that in order to prosper, in order to be eligible for investment, in order to be eligible for mortgage loans, they had to avoid black spaces.
These maps started to define the boundaries.
Essentially, on the redline map, all of this would be redline,
yes,
including where we are actually headed towards. And can you tell us, like, if we're walking a physical line here, where would the line stop?
That line, you cross St. Charles Avenue on the other side, you start to get more into the green category. The streetcar line is a natural boundary, right? That begins to create sort of a different feel and some could call it a barricade to the other side. Natural barricades, some unnatural barricades, creates a sort of distinction and separation. So you started to see African Americans become more contained in areas, let's say like a central city. You start to see sort of the outlying areas of basically where African Americans are.
Oh my God, really? If you essentially segregate black folks and other people of color into certain neighborhoods, then you're going to have compounding effects in terms of, exposure to violence, lack of access to healthy foods, a number of isolating effects that are going to be detrimental. And there's a strong correlation between neighborhoods that were redlined, meaning the FHA would not loan to them, and neighborhoods that continue today to be segregated and impoverished.
All these people buying up stuff around here. They buying up everything.
We don't have nowhere as far as entertainment. You was able to go to Washington for Red and watch the band. You was able to go on Claiborne, by Jeans. have none of that.
A whole lot is totally different out here.
So neighborhoods like Central City are essentially still in the red. Like when you look within the bounds of Central City, you don't necessarily find a fully functioning grocery store. They tried to do this with the Fresh Food Retailer Initiative, and that didn't necessarily work out. Now, when you have a community like this that experiences generational denial, they are bound to feel the weight of that. You have to also remember that Central City was red on the HOLC maps, and those communities that were on red in the HOLC maps experienced homelessness, poverty, high crime rates, low birth rates, health outcomes that were disastrous, and of course wealth outcomes that never really made it there.
Yep.
This fly's gonna kill me.
I know.
No. Hang out.
I know.
Yeah, what kind of dogs do you have?
We have a lab pit mix.
Ooh.
I grew up in Southern California and moved to New Orleans in 2009, and I was a firefighter for a good chunk of the last decade. My first fire station was in Central City. My awareness of the ways, especially that policy has shaped inequitable access to many of our society's key material things for survival really came into clarity and focus when I moved to New Orleans. You know, when you're a first responder in Central City, a lot of the calls for service that we get are for folks that are having shortness of breath or complications from heart disease or diabetes. In a world that was more equitably and justly run, like these are primary care concerns that a physician would be dealing with. Instead, you know, they're calling the healthcare option of last resort, which is 911,
right,
to get a ride to the hospital. And you only have to go 3 blocks to St. Charles Avenue and confront a totally different reality.
4 people were shot and a 5th was killed in a shooting in Central City.
It happens too much.
Wednesday in Central City, a 19-year-old was in a car when someone started shooting.
We can look at the social stresses, growing up in a high crime neighborhood, growing up listening to gunfire every night, growing up, you know, seeing people get killed, get murdered, you know, in front of you. That adds a psychological, socio stress on the individual.
Who wants to see their child get killed in front of you? In front of your face, right there.
People that grow up in these environments tend to develop health problems. It shouldn't surprise anyone. And so, and so it's not just your financial health, it's not just your economic health or your educational health. It is actually your physical health as a human being that is affected when you grow up in a poor neighborhood. I have some friends that work in the medical field, and they always say that your zip code is more important than your genetic code in terms of the sort of social indicators of health where you grew up.
Is there another neighborhood that you looked at maybe that you're interested in, that you wanted to go into?
No, well, I didn't have no money. I had to do the best I could with what I had.
They didn't have privilege to buy a home. I mean, even up here, they had on homeowners, but most of these properties was owned by whites, and they were renting. Some people had been living here all their lives. Right. It didn't really get started until they started opening up residents, like what's the name of the subdivision out on the lake?
Pontchartrain Park?
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
From the pre-1930s all the way to about 1970 or so, the amount of homes built in New Orleans. And if you do a simple calculation on what those houses sold for back then and what they sell for today, right?
Right.
And how much lost wealth as a result of that. you're basically frozen out of it. You got to think about that.
Right.
That is like massive.
So you don't have any equity in a home. You're not able to build any wealth.
No, you have nothing to pass on.
But it's not just about the house or the type of home that's built, but how whoever lives inside of that home can really determine a community's fate, whether that community is going to be invested into or if it's going to be left in the dust. Now, I learned that the federal and state agencies did everything they can to sort of maintain like a social order. So they did this by placing restrictions on homeowners that they insured. And if you take a look at your deeds right now, those restrictions are not enforceable today, but the language just might still be there.
Back in the old days, we actually had racial covenants where you were required to only sell to a certain race.
Throughout the United States, including in New Orleans, entire suburbs and entire subdivisions were created with this sort of assurance that there would be restrictive covenants and no properties would be transferred to blacks, to ensure that segregation remained in place.
I moved here October 1988.
Okay.
And I rented the house for 18 years. Me and the lady that owned it, Beverly, she was a Caucasian lady, and I met her mom. And we got along very well and became good, pretty good friends. Mm-hmm. So after Katrina, when we were getting ready to try to fix the house up again, I made her an offer to buy it. I was just sitting in here one day and I started reading through the deed. When I got to restrictions and I saw this part here that said, no sale of said land or any part thereof shall ever be made to any other than a person of the Caucasian race.
Wow.
And I was just, what?
What did you think about it when you saw it? Have you ever seen anything like that or heard of that?
I've never seen of that. I've never seen it.
When her mother, Beverly's mother, bought the house, or when they built the house, what was the neighborhood like?
She said it was mostly houses like this, and everybody was Caucasian. Right. There was no blacks in this area. Even when I lived here, there was only me and the people next door that were black.
Wow.
Everyone else was still Caucasian, predominantly Caucasian in this area.
And that was in 1988?
That was in 88.
This is called a restrictive covenant. Okay. And so if they would have upheld the covenant, it was a way for white people to build homes and prevent anyone of color from moving into the neighborhood. So that's why I think it's such an odd thing today in this area, which is likely majority black now.
Even after all the old racial covenants were stricken down by the Supreme Court, so even though it couldn't be enforced in law anymore, there was a sort of an unwritten social contract that if you were going to sell your home, if you were a white homeowner and you were going to sell your home, you would only sell your home to another white homeowner because you wanted to maintain the current racial structure of the neighborhood. The reality is we still are a segregated city.
So what do you have that you can show me today?
Nothing in this price range. Nothing at all.
This situation could not have happened without this sort of confluence of actors. Blockbusting is a concept where if you look at the maps and the threat of African Americans moving into your neighborhood presents a challenge to your perceived investments in your property. So if it is viewed that African Americans are going to penetrate that line, I'm concerned about my value. Here comes the Real Estate Association. Even in 1924, they submitted this as part of their code of ethics. They would not support any transactions where loans would be given to African Americans. Real estate agents, white real estate agents, would basically scare the crap out of white homeowners. They would, so for example, hire an African American to drive through the neighborhood playing loud music. Hiring an African American woman to walk down the neighborhood pushing a stroller with black kids in it. Having an African American call a white household using a traditional black name and scare the crap out of them. Right? That's blockbusting.
This is one of the councils that
So you go through the process, you get the house, everything goes smoothly. And
I thought it was anyway.
So you start to move in.
Yeah.
What happens?
The day I was moving, that was March the 13th. I remember that date, 1968, when I was getting ready to move in. The gentleman next door, keeping in mind, it's all white. I'm moving into the middle of a neighborhood that is all white at the time. And he swore that he would never spend a night in the block with a colored person. So I backed up to move in. He backed up with a U-Haul to move out. And the process started from there. The next morning when I woke up and looked outside, there was a for sale sign on every house, and not just this block, but in this area around. I had heard about it and read about it from other places, but I never had the experience of dealing with it.
Well, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 supposedly put an end to race-based housing discrimination, but the FHA already set a precedent. They made people believe that homes that were mostly occupied by black people or by any minority meant that loans wouldn't be economically sound or that the property values just might go down. So while the federal government reversed its course, or was really forced to reverse its course on housing discrimination, there was still a lot going on in the private sector.
You served in the military, and you were able to get the GI Bill. You had the ability to purchase a home wherever you wanted to purchase a home.
Yeah.
You told me someone else did not get the ability. Who was it?
My wife's father.
Really?
And he was a World War II veteran, served in Normandy.
Okay.
And he wasn't able, his first house, he wasn't able to get
use the GI Bill.
Why wasn't he able to use it?
Because
it was black?
Yeah, they wasn't allowing black soldiers to use it.
Was it that they weren't allowing it, or they didn't allow them to get homes in certain neighborhoods?
They did not allow it.
Nice house, isn't it? Sure, it's nice. And if I'm lucky, after I get out, in 5 or 10 years, I'll have one pretty much like it. Well, George Tobin, just driving in, didn't have to wait any 5 or 10 years. As soon as he got out of the Navy, he applied to the Director of Finance, Veterans Administration in Washington. And they were able to help him get a loan by guaranteeing it up to $2,000. Of course, George, like every veteran, had to meet certain conditions, prove he was a reliable citizen. The GI Bill of Rights is not a reward, or a handout, or a gravy train, but rather an American way to make it easier for each man to take his place once again in the community and get some of those things for which he went to war. A job, a business, an education, a home.
Be nice to people.
He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B.
He is the oldest veteran in the United States.
They have a room dedicated to him in the church. My daddy was in the 91st Engineer Battalion.
When did he discharge from the service?
1945.
45?
Mm-hmm. He was stationed in Australia, New Guinea, and the Philippines.
And he certainly faced discrimination and racism.
He moved in with you at 100.
He was 100 years old when he came at that point. I was just beginning to notice some things about like his income, for instance. You know, he was getting like a $93 check every month, retirement from what?
The VA?
The VA. Yeah, the VA. I was like, Daddy, you should be getting more money than this. Mm-hmm. He said, oh no, baby, that's all I get. I've been getting that for years.
You said we brought up the GI Bill.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened when you brought it up to him? How did that all go about?
He hadn't taken advantage of his GI Bill. I had asked him, but Daddy was like 111 at that time. See what I'm saying? So it was real late. And I asked him about the GI Bill, and he was like, baby, nobody never told me anything about it. I said, you didn't know anything about the GI Bill? He said, no, baby, I never knew anything about it. So I asked him, I said, well, if you never knew about it, I said, nobody at the VA never talked to you about it or mentioned it to you or anything like that? He said, no, baby, nobody never mentioned it to me. He couldn't read, he couldn't write. He did not know because he was illiterate.
Tell me a little bit about what life was like for you growing up.
We grew up in a real, like a tiny home.
Where was it?
It was on Magnolia.
Central City?
Phillip. Yeah. Right around the corner from here. And it was a living room, one bedroom.
Oh, wow.
One tiny bathroom and a little kitchen. I think the reason we lived in this neighborhood is because he probably couldn't afford to live anywhere else. It was a privately struck area. I guess some of the people that lived in the area, they were wealthy. They did pretty good. They owned their own homes, but we didn't. But I know he was a forklift driver after he got out of the military.
He just
and he did that. Yeah, he did like a labor.
Did he get any benefits at all? Any help? How was he treated when he got back?
He told me the people in Australia treated him better than the people here in America.
The GI Bill Restoration Act was introduced into Congress to rectify these injustices. It was to extend GI benefits to some surviving spouses and Black descendants of Black World War II veterans. But unfortunately, this has not moved through the legislative process, so it's still sitting in Congress. Now, there were some Black GIs who were able to take advantage of their GI benefits, but some of them were facing limited housing stock, while others were relegated to housing that was directly connected to hazardous land.
This is kind of like the example of what was happening to African Americans. You know, we're going to build homes for you in less desirable areas, you know, and having to live next to power lines and former incinerators.
On the surface, this community looks like it's decent, but we know that to not be true, obviously. Some people say you can't draw a hard line when it comes to health and whatnot in this community to redlining, because they chose to live in this community. It was a community built for Black people. It was a community that was built for Black people by a Black mayor.
It will neither be a Black administration nor a white administration.
The history of New Orleans and its actions through policy and private actions really highlights this as an example of what was taking place. So the demand for housing, home ownership in the African American community, and demand and desire for it is just as great as anybody else. But to the question of it was built under a Black mayor, this was started before Dutch Morial.
Right.
Our lives
are at further risk.
This area is under investigation again.
I'm afraid of dying.
How many children was actually tested at Moby School?
The EPA should help us.
Neighborhoods were built on top of hazardous waste sites because under current EPA laws, it's illegal, but it wasn't always illegal.
They found 7 homes with alarming levels of lead poisoning.
Our children don't have a chance.
The EPA regulations that prohibit building houses on hazardous waste sites are relatively recent, just in the last couple decades.
These people on the school board just were not listening. They wouldn't listen to the reports. They wouldn't listen to what the scientists told us, and they just decided that they wanted to build it there and they were going to do it no matter what.
A lot of times the hazardous waste sites might have been really old sites from the 30s, 40s, or 50s. Then the waste was buried, they were paved over. You know, it might have been a vacant piece of land for 10 or 20 years. And then a developer decides, okay, well, you know, I think I'd like to build, housing development on this area. Not only could that developer build there without any sort of mitigation in terms of taking the waste out, but that developer was not under any legal obligation to let any homeowners know what was underneath their homes.
It was a new brick home, and back then, you know, brick homes. Now you don't see too many big brick homes being built unless that's what you request. So very modern, and so I jumped for it. I was living uptown then. So I can't even let my grandkids go out. A lot of the people talked about being first-time home buyers, so this was very exciting. And not thinking at the time, these homes were marketed low middle income families, but marketed to African Americans only.
Really?
Yes.
We are in a fight for our life. Our overdue demand is met of a fully funded relocation so that we may safely move off the toxic landfill that the city of New Orleans built our homes on.
Those left behind in homes on the land the Environmental Protection Agency deemed a Superfund site have spent nearly 30 years fighting for a fully funded relocation. And for many of them, that day has finally come.
Good morning. How are you?
How are you?
Welcome.
Thank you so much. You were told at one point by people that this wouldn't happen.
They said, oh, you're fighting another lost cause. The 5 of us were very determined to organize and to fight because we knew, we felt, and as I stated, we prayed. And in the end, by the grace of God, we were all able to move out of that community.
I do love this for you.
Thank you. I sit out front and just look around and say, thank you, Jesus.
It has been a journey.
It has been a journey. The last 3 years was very trying.
We are in no position to be silent about it.
Having to show up at City Hall, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, and just fighting for something that we should not have had to fight so hard for.
It required us to fight and toil.
We want to live. How many more of us have to die on that toxic site?
You were diagnosed with breast cancer while you were living in Gordon Plaza.
Correct. I and many of my neighbors of various types of cancer. The doctors, if you told them that you felt like this was related to you living on toxic soil, they never, they would say possibly, but I'm here today. It's 7 years cancer-free.
Look at an opportunity to create something that would generate power. So something that was once draining this community is now actually going to provide sustainable power for this community.
I hope they put the solar plant back there and do whatever they have to do back there as far as that's concerned. And not put another human being back there to go through what we went through for decades.
only trying to live the American dream and pursue generational wealth for our families like the normal American citizen.
What made you decide to do this story? Why was it so important for you to follow the line?
Because I wanted to tell the story about how we got here to this point.
And where is here?
Discriminatory lending practices by financial institutions still exist. Unfortunately, redlining remains a persistent form of discrimination that harms minority communities.
Because the lines are gone.
Yeah.
You say, oh, no, it's not, it can't be racism, it can't go back to that. It's gotta be about the fact that they are just not trying hard enough.
Lending discrimination runs counter to fundamental promises of our economic system.
Instead of looking at how the system, how those red lines have constrained and deprived that family and the family next door to them and the family in that entire block and in that part of that city, how they've all been deprived of opportunity by these lines that have disappeared, except in their lives.
When people are denied credit simply because of their race or national origin, their ability to share in our nation's prosperity is all but eliminated. Redlining contributed to the large racial wealth gap that exists in this country. The practice made it extremely difficult for people of color to accumulate wealth. That discrepancy in wealth is clearly reflected in current home ownership rates.
My name's Robert Hand. I own Louisiana Commercial Realty in New Orleans. I have offices in Hattiesburg and New Orleans. I've been a commercial real estate broker in New Orleans for 20 years. Back in 2018, I couldn't figure out why businesses in New Orleans East, where I had a 5-acre listing, and businesses were calling me to try to develop that property, I couldn't figure out why they could never get financing. So I started doing some research, found some data offered by the Consumer Financial Protections Bureau. So I dug deep into the data and found out that loans to black people in New Orleans were denied at twice the national rate. In each category of income, whether it's extremely below average or extremely above average, the data that I'm able to pull from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau goes back to 2023.
One agency the president wants to expunge is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
It was a bad group of people running it. That was a vicious group of people. They really destroyed a lot of people.
Congress created the CFPB to protect people from getting swindled.
We're trying to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse.
When you talk about the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, can you explain to us what exactly that organization is?
It's the only agency that protects the consumer. It goes back to 2008. Do you remember back in 2008, we had one of the nastiest recessions. That was brought on by a financial crisis where people would borrow money to buy houses with the expectation that those properties would increase in value. And the banks, in their appraisal and their approval process, assumed that that inflation would increase. Congress passed what's called the Dodd-Frank Act. What we're dealing with is a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau whose mission is to protect the consumer and prevent this kind of fraud from happening again.
We We virtually shut down the out-of-control CFPB, escorting radical left bureaucrats out of the building and locking the doors behind them.
What is the risk that we run by eliminating this agency?
There's no watchdog. I mean, even with the data, this has been going on since we know of in 2009 and long before then. If we don't have the data, then we don't know more about the problem to fix it.
There have been a number of laws and proposals set to address housing discrimination and housing inequality, helping to prevent it. There have been zoning laws. There's nonprofits, the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance. There was even a vote that was passed by New Orleans voters recently where 2% of the city's general fund would go towards preserving and building affordable housing, again, addressing that disparity. But there's only one city in the nation that has actually taken the step to right the wrongs by putting money directly into the Black residents' pockets in form of reparations.
In 2019, Evanston, Illinois was the first in the nation to implement reparations.
Most folks hear reparations and think about some sort of cash benefit, a check, but there are actually 5 components of reparations, and housing falls under one of those 5.
Robin Rue Simmons championed reparations here. She now runs First Repair, helping other communities do the same.
So take me back to the beginning when you were the alderman for the city of Evanston, and at some point you decided the only way to notably make change is through reparations. That is, despite you not running on that platform.
After a couple years in office, I came to the conclusion that reparations was the most appropriate legislative response, that it is attainable, that it is just.
The banks would not allow them they wouldn't give them money to buy outside of this area. It was very challenging.
So our community, like most others in the United States, had anti-Black and very racist housing laws, zoning laws. And it has led to our current racial segregation, wealth gap, all the gaps we have here. And we had to figure out, now that we've said yes to repair, we've identified a funding mechanism to begin this work, exactly what is reparative and how do we implement it. A couple years after that, we began dispersing our first reparations program, which is known as a restorative housing program.
This is what trying to narrow the wealth gap can look like. Ramona Burton is one of 16 eligible residents picked in a lottery to receive $25,000 in reparations.
It's a $25,000 direct benefit to build wealth through home equity. The grant could be used in a few different ways, and eventually cash was one of those options for residents that needed to be more nimble.
So what has been the response from the community?
It's done so much to change hearts and minds. Business as usual has kept us racially divided, and there are new ways that we can approach reparations that aren't creating a race riot. We have the nation's largest Black-owned bank, Liberty Bank, that committed to reparative financial products. So we have a community that now has access to fair lending and other financial tools and learning that can multiply their wealth.
Well, the passion for home ownership for me is very personal.
Liberty Bank has branches in 11 states and is the only Black bank in the country with more than $1 billion in assets.
And if you take a look at America today, most wealth in America is through acquisition of real estate. Whether it's investment real estate, whether it's commercial real estate, or residential properties. That's where most of the wealth comes from.
There's financial freedom. And we try to do as an organization to put individuals and families in a better position. So we're being very deliberate about refinancing individuals out of predatory loans. We're being very deliberate in making creative products to help individuals and families' monthly cash flow improve so that they can start a business or they can save for a down payment and ultimately buy a home.
Back in '72, Norman Francis, the chairman of the board, and it was his brain thrust that moved us to starting a bank back in 1972. And the need was huge back then. The need was huge, primarily just from a home ownership position and to borrow money. Back then, most of the African Americans borrowed money from finance companies that perhaps had more than double-digit interest rates.
The water is steady rising in the attic, ma'am. And I'm a drown in the attic.
Coming all through the floors, through the doors.
Pray for me, huh? Oh, sir, I will pray. I will have to pray for everybody, even myself.
If you look at the rest of the city, you will see there's a direct correlation between race, income, and lower flood elevation. Generally speaking, the poor folks and the black folks are going to be in the lower flood elevations.
When we woke up, they had water coming right through the floors, and that's when we had to go to the attic.
The only exception to that is the Lakeview area, and the Lakeview area is a white wealthy area simply because it's right next to lake, and so as a principle of real estate, if you're close to a body of water, if you're close to a waterfront, the property values go up.
My mother and I, we're stranded in the attic, and she's a diabetic.
And so people wonder why, oh, well, it just seems like, whenever we have a hurricane and things flood, it seems like, more black folk are on top of houses needing to be rescued than white folk.
Trying to get the attention of rescuers.
And people need to understand there's a specific historic reason. It was deliberate political activity.
It just seemed like that as soon as good things were happening for Louisiana people, the rug would be pulled out.
The former governor is talking about the Kathleen Babineau Blanco Road Home Program, the biggest housing recovery effort in American history.
One of the things that the Road Home did was it used pre-storm value to cap assistance. Now, the insanity of that, right? Like, we got number one, that is insane. A disaster has happened. Who cares what it was worth before the disaster? The point of the program is to get people home, to get them to rebuild. The argument is through no fault of their own, they have been injured. That is why the federal government is allocating billions of dollars with a B. That is what the people of this country and the people of the world expected. Yeah. So why, when you get down to the bureaucracy, does the policy start with, let's cap this based on what the property is worth?
The $10 billion Road Home Program got money to 40,000 homes in the city, but as many as 6,000 of them remain blighted all these years later. The blight is particularly high in neighborhoods like the Florida area, Central City, and the lower 9th Ward.
I quickly found that because of the way they had created the program, the Road Home Program, and giving grants based on the value of the house, not on the cost of rebuilding each house, you ended up in a situation where the same exact house, same size, same materials, in two different neighborhoods, one majority black, one majority white, were getting different amounts of money because of the historically lower values of homes in black neighborhoods.
We have properties that have been untouched since the day of the storm.
The NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Fair Housing Group sued to say that this was discrimination, racial discrimination. And it never concluded in court.
But you said that settling outside of court kind of was a missed opportunity for them to correct some of the wrongs of the past.
This was a huge disaster. We can almost start fresh, start over, and correct the wrongs of the past where people in black neighborhoods had devalued homes because of redlining, because of these historic inequities with home lending. And all of that could have been wiped away if they had created a program that was more equitable. And they missed the opportunity. And I don't think that there was any evidence that that was done on purpose. In fact, there were a number of things that they implemented, including additional grants for lower income people that was supposed to wipe away some of those historic inequities based on how much people made based on their income. The problem was you had middle class black families
who made too much money to qualify for that, but still lived in majority black neighborhoods where the values of the homes were depressed and were affected by redlining over many, many decades, and they were excluded from any of those additional grants.
Now we're going into the east.
Man. This is called the ghettoization of a community.
What does that mean?
That means you're pushing all the low-income people out in this direction, which from a spending pattern is counter to industry locating in the community. The lack of investment, it's the broken window theory. You know, you're not going to invest in the area and you see all of this.
The East was the place to live.
78 and 80, when the plaza was thriving, we had good commerce out here.
What did you find when you came out here today?
Heartbreak. Nothing that I wanted to see.
Katrina just put a nail in the coffin.
You're putting people in economic groups, for the most part, into one area of the city, which means that you're stopping economic growth in a lot of different ways. For example, in the East, we can't get a supermarket to locate here, whereas there are supermarkets all over the city elsewhere. So when you don't have the growth, the economic growth, then that part of the city is going to die economically.
I'll just go to Chalmette. There's nothing out here.
Unless the city comes up with a bona fide vision and strategy for New Orleans East, it's not going to move.
What I found when I talked with residents in New Orleans East is we want businesses to come in and take a chance on us. Well, that's not going to happen. Businesses come in because they think they can make money. Mm-hmm. Businesses can make money in New Orleans East. We just have to show them the data and promote the story because it has a stigma. So I did the research. I dug deep into where people are spending their money that live there. They spend $82 million, but there are only $53 million in grocery store sales. That's a gap. Mm-hmm. That's an opportunity for a business to come in and capture that $29 million difference. So what I found was a misperception that New Orleans East does not attract businesses. They're spending money, they're just not spending it in New Orleans East. Mm-hmm. If you'll put a business here, that business will thrive. I'm just shocked that nobody in government really knows how to grow an area and bring businesses back.
It's frustrating seeing the whole neighborhood being turned into these kind of units.
All the newcomers coming to the neighborhood made me feel like they're trying to push the people out.
Things are steadily changing around here, you know, like around the corner, those buildings that they're
the Airbnbs or whatever they are.
When we grew up, we had no idea that would ever happen.
A paper came out that they maybe want to change that to a hotel.
Do you want to keep the house in the family? Do you want to keep this house?
Yeah.
Yes. So even if things are developing around you all and you're getting pressure to sell, you're not going to?
Well, I'm not.
Even though at one time we thought it was terrible, but this was the mecca, this area for black culture.
Even though they had a whole lot of problem with the social life in the neighborhood, it wasn't totally bad.
When we moved, it's gone.
I want to thank y'all so much for having me here, really and truly. And I know y'all have more food to get to, apparently, because I know that there's cake over there.